The true story of my dear friend George Talboys' trip to Australia all began with a letter he received in the mail one fateful evening in England. You see, he ran into some troubles financially, and in a moment of complete desperation, he was finally given a way to redemption. The letter informed him that his father had passed away and left him a huge inheritance. However, there were stipulations. As you may know, his father had hated his wife, and this was his father's chance of separating them. His father would only allow his attorney to give George the money if George moved to Australia, left his old life, and everyone in it behind and started all over. George realizes how much his family needs this money, and after debating with himself for some time, he realizes that he must take the risk. He waits until midnight on the day of his departure, writes a goodbye letter to his wife, and leaves without telling a soul his plans. He is going to go to Australia, ending the inheritance and then escaping with the money. The boat ride was a long and lonely journey. He continually questions his decision to leave his wife and his child behind, and wonders how they're going to do without him. He finally arrives and is greeted at the port by his father's butler, a well-dressed gentleman in his mid-30s. Immediately impressed with his father's high-class servant, he has no idea what to expect of his fortune, and is now exponentially larger compared to when he was younger. When he arrives at his father's estate in Sydney, he is in shock. The mile-long drive from the main road to his house was filled with waterfalls, exotic animals, beautiful gardens, and even a kangaroo farm. He finally reaches the house and can hardly view it all, even in his peripheral vision. It was even bigger than Windsor Castle in England. George was fascinated with the architecture and the luxury of this wonder. He was amazed that his father became so rich. You see, George lived in Australia for a short time with his father when he was much younger. He lived in a nice neighbourhood, but nothing comparable. After being given a tour of his new house and shown where his quarters were, he began to reminisce about his time he spent in his youth in Australia. These memories brought back the thought of his adolescent sweetheart, Isabella. They were separated when he moved to England with his father, and he had not spoken to her since. George quickly loses touch with his reason in coming to Australia. He became so rich that the world was in his hands. The nightlife of Sydney was far too much for George's willpower to compete with. He spent his nights in only the most exclusive restaurants and bars, having the time of his life. He bought everything he wanted, and even if he didn't want something, he bought it anyway, simply because he could. After a night downtown one evening in Sydney, George decides to go to the beach. While walking along the shore, he comes across his childhood friend Isabella. They are both stunned that they have found each other once again, and talk for hours. His old feelings for her begin to show, and unfortunately for my pal George, he is more interested than ever. Over the next few months, George and Isabella spend much time together. Several afternoons each week were passed on the porch, reading books about worldly travel, elegant food, popular music. They had rich conversations about society, Isabella always teasingly insisting that the English countryside did not compare to the magnificent Australian outback. Weeks passed in their How do you say it in Australian?
Oh my god.
Do you need to just delete this part out?
Alright, keep going.
No, I don't know. How do you say that in Australian?
Just keep going!
Dude, I don't know how to say
Skip
this
the
word.
What is the word?
Caucasish? Is that how you say
Just
it?
in their banner. Fuck that word. Just go.
Okay. I'm going to start the sentence over again. So just delete this whole part out as when you do this. Weeks passed, and their banter eventually evolved into insightful dialogue as topics of religion and politics crossed their lips. Each time she spoke, George was reminded why he fell in love with her when he was younger. She was so wise at such a young age, yet she always maintained a sense of modesty and curiosity for the world around her. One day, George was reminded of Isabella's love for art, so he takes her to the museum in a nearby town. He begins to take her on several excursions each week, taking various trips to destinations around Australia, such as Newcastle, Brisbane, and Hobart. One weekend, in celebration of George's birthday, the two decide they are going to Sydney to explore the shops and restaurants. After a long, bumpy carriage ride, they finally arrive in the city, astounded by the hundreds of heads bobbing up and down as they went in and out of streetcars and storefronts. The two walk into a store and explore its offerings. As they approach a case of jewelry, the shopkeeper approaches George with a slight smile and spread across his face and points to Isabella. "Looking for something nice to buy the missus?" Startled that someone mistook Isabella for his wife, George merely shakes his head and pretends not to have heard. They browse the shelves a little longer, then walk out the store and onto the streets of Sydney. As they stroll down the road, George starts to wonder how his wife and his son were doing. He had managed not to think about his wife and son for some time now, but the shopkeeper brought back the pangs of guilt and regret he felt when he first left England. The following day they returned to George's farm, resuming their routine of reading on the porch and discussing their thoughts of the day. Reminded of the wife he so abruptly left behind, George's peace of mind has been permanently polluted by remorse. One day he is unable to focus on his novel, so he decides to go to the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water. He enters the house and walks toward the kitchen, but stops immediately in his tracks as he hears the sounds of shouting voices. He tiptoes closer and discerns the voices of his butler and his maid. George cannot tell what they are arguing about, so he presses his ear against the kitchen door to listen.
Just say, says the butler.
"We must tell him,"
Says the butler.
"Why would we want to ruin his opinion of his father? I say we keep it secret unless he absolutely must," said the maid in a higher pitch. George falls into the kitchen from leaning in too eagerly on the door, and the maid jumps for a surprise. He jumps to his feet and does not even bother explaining himself. "By golly, what are you two arguing about, telling me or not telling me? I hope you know that withholding information from me is enough reason for me to let you both go." "Sir, we can explain," cries the maid. "Allow me," says the butler sternly. He went on to explain to George how his father had acquired his fortune. While George grew up thinking it was from his success and luck as a gold miner, in reality it was from his father's ability to keep a secret. William Talboy was a cunning young man who moved to Australia to build a fortune by mining gold, but also by using his sly skills as a swindler. The butler recounts the day that changed the course of William Talboy's life. William had been digging for gold all day, and had decided to stay later than the other miners because he had heard that there was a huge deposit somewhere in the area. Alongside him was a co-worker named Paul. The two lone workers were digging when William heard Paul give a shout of joy. He ran over to see... I'll start that again. He ran over to him and saw at the tip of his shovel a huge deposit of gold, larger than William had ever seen. Jealousy overcame him as he wondered why he had not been the one to discover it. In an instant of insuppressible envy, William swung his shovel in the air and straight for the back of Paul's head. With a loud clank, Paul's knee buckled and he fell to the ground. William pocketed the gold and never saw a mine again. George is stunned. He refuses to believe that his father, the role model and inspiration of his life, could have committed such an immoral act. He storms out of the kitchen, through the front door, off the porch and into his yard. Pacing the grounds of this undeserved, corrupted land, he flashes through his childhood with his father, searching his brain for absolutely anything that could have proven or disproven this accusation. He remembered that his father used to have terrible insomnia, shaking and screaming during the night. On one particular restless night, George recalls lying in bed as an adolescent and hearing the scream, "Take the gold! You can have it! You were the one that found it! Just take it!" George's stomach drops and he realized the high likelihood of his father's guilt. He cannot believe that the person he looked up to the most in life had lived such a huge lie. Everything he had ever bought for George and his family belonged to someone else. Everything he had ever told George about earning his fortune had been a lie. George has no idea what to do, but he knows he cannot stand to be in Australia any longer. The gravity of his actions begins to sink in, and George slowly recognizes how selfish it had been of him to abandon his family. Now my friend George has been known to make somewhat rash decisions, so in this moment of confusion and in shame he decides he cannot spend a single night longer in Australia. He recognizes, however, that he cannot return to England empty-handed. In his hasteness to escape, he decides that he cannot return to England empty-handed, so he runs to his father's safe and steals as much gold as he can fit in his bag. He feels a stab of remorse taking that stolen gold, but is overcome with his desire to hold his wife and his son in his arms once again. After leaving a note for Isabella and making arrangements for his father's house to be sold, George goes to the airport an evening and takes the... After leaving a note for Isabella and making arrangements for his father's house to be sold, George goes to the port that evening and takes the next boat for England. Poor George Talboy returned to England and learned that his wife had passed away and his son had gone to live with his father-in-law. While George's story did not end well, his dishonesty can serve as an example to us all. Live honestly, my friend, and live well.